Alright, response video to Professor Anton? Okay, reaction video anyway. I don't know if he'll respond or whatever. No real point. I'm going to play his video just because it's an interesting video, I think. Just the way he talks about this subject. So the title is interesting. Humans Are Insane, which is an interesting title. And he just points out a couple of the obvious, that there are these just obvious things about human beings, like how much this is an example he used, but I'll use the example. Well, he uses the example of, say, sports worship and nationalism, racism. These are all kind of silly things humans do. But beyond that, there are these priorities that just seem backwards and upside down. Why so much attention to the victims of a plane crash versus the victims of a drunk driver? Just way out of proportion priorities. American Idol versus the national debt. Nobody dealing with anything real, lost in all kinds of nonsense. And this sort of in the context of, what is the, is there any plane, any plateau, any position from which some sort of argument can be made that this is the road, okay? These are all fake roads, and this is one good road that you can take that'll get you someplace reasonable and rational in terms of how you're seeing your existence, understanding the context of it. So the context of this video is that conference report did do a video sort of in response, at least playing with the word delusion, which has been part of this previous conversation from the God Delusion in Dawkins' book. And again, another video just kind of placating this notion that, we're all deluded and there's no difference between one delusion and another delusion, and it's just, I just think this is totally useless nonsense to make no distinctions. Just to say we're all, because somebody murders a lobster for dinner, to say we're all assassins. That's exactly the same thing as raping and molesting and murdering a 13-year-old girl. No, they're not the same thing. We can make distinctions, rational, reasonable distinctions, and we can do that about what the range or the vessel of reasonable belief. There's a container. We can call it reasonable belief and put it on the shelf. And as every second ticks, what is possible to put in that container of reasonable belief is getting smaller and smaller. The truth is revealing itself to us, and there's just no more excuses for demons and other nonsense. It's been dispelled. It's been converted into nonsense. And we can know it for what it is. It's nonsense, and it shouldn't be defended by anyone reasonable. So anyway, that's an awful long premise, sorry. Let's get to business.
Okay, so there's a little bit
this will be a long video, maybe I'll do it in parts.
These days, people talking about whether or not religious belief is a form of insanity, or whether or not, mental illness is characterizing theists, whether it's more characteristic of atheists. Are the people who are making these claims mentally ill? This sort of interesting, I guess, juxtaposition back and forth between both.
Yeah, well, shouldn't the juxtaposition be, though, that there's whether we call it an illness or a brokenness of conditioning or habit or tradition, it just doesn't really matter, right? But we should be able to sit there and make distinctions and say there's a difference between these belief systems, and there is a consequential difference. It will change how you interact with the world. What you believe is critically important. How you act in the world is critically important. It's not a matter of trivial importance. It's a matter of, it means everything. You're not going to be the next Martin Luther King if you don't realize there needs to be another Martin Luther King kind of thing. It's not going to happen unless you think it needs to happen. All of these things are just, make a critical difference. it really is important. Every influence we have in the world can be incredibly significant, even the ones that are inadvertent. The ones that are deliberate and the ones that are constructed by our will and our understanding, likewise, can be critically important. I changed the world just by creating one more man or one more woman in the world, because then I can change a whole implication of who marries who. Just by changing one relationship, I can change another relationship, another relationship. They all cascade. It cascades through all these other relationships, because now everybody's life is in a way changed. So it's important to get this stuff right.
Belief in what's taken to be somehow irrational, or that for which we don't have adequate scientific evidence.
Well, again, so couldn't we just apply a standard like, what is this reasonable standard? This reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Is this a belief that can be accepted, or it's unacceptable? And we put in this unacceptable, we convict it of being nonsense, and we convict it by a standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, it's nonsense, kind of thing. Put it on trial. What's wrong with doing that?
And I guess something like the claim that this is a mental illness or something like that.
Well, I think you've done plenty of talking about these kind of habits and traditions, and certainly you could argue that it's a mental syndrome. I mean, again, I'm going to make the argument that we hear of things called like mass hysteria, and we see pop culture. We see what it does to people. We see what people do when they're in gangs versus what they would do as individuals. That's a studied phenomenon. So, yeah, this is a lot of psychology here. That is a preface to philosophy. You have to have psychology that makes it possible for you to even do philosophy, because you have to have enough humility in your psychology to even realize that truth is bigger than you are. Or you're not really going to be able to see the truth, are you?
And I wanted to maybe open the discussion into a much larger, set of issues. And it would be, some people have literally argued that the human is the insane animal.
Well, again, we can argue that being an animal, you're intrinsically insane in the sense that you are possessed, by needs and desires that you do not rationally contrive or construct. They aren't constructed out of reason. They're constructed out of biology and hormones and physical structures that say, I want, to compel you. And so in that sense, they are insane in the sense that they never go through the filter of having to be reasonable or coherent to reality or coherent to circumstances. They're commandments and compulsions and a compelling that comes from another source. So in a sense they are a possession. We're possessed by this kind of bazuzu of our psychology. And that is a fundamental function, is this motivational I need, I want, I must attain, I must have. This ego gratification, this alpha status, that is a kind of insanity in the sense that it is not filtered by intelligence. It's not filtered by sound reasoning. It's only a compulsion, a biological mechanism.
It's not that religious people are insane or atheistic people are insane, or that there's a kind of insanity that comes from...
Well, again, if we understand that we use the word insane to basically describe somebody who is destructive in general terms, we don't bother calling things insane that are benign and harmless. But that's the catch, right? Is that you don't know what's harmless until it harms you a lot of times, or what's not, the harmful can be disguised as something harmless until it rises and harms you. But again, the bottom line is that we can understand function and dysfunction. We can understand accurate and inaccurate. So I think by those standards you can argue that if a brain is producing an inaccurate personal narrative, I think I'm Superman, I have a whole fake story about my previous lives, I was Cleopatra, whatever, some sort of crap. And it's absolute crap. Okay, there's nothing wrong with combining, or at least recognizing that there's a parallel between broken and wrong. I mean, a wrong story, a wrong answer to a question can be seen as what gives wrong answers. Well, if you have a calculator and it gives you a wrong answer, you're not going to say it's working right. You're going to say it's broken.
Particularly curtailed, or these little domains of belief that you can locate it and circumscribe it there. It's instead this sense that to dwell in the various levels of abstraction that humans do is to already court kinds of madness.
Well, again, so you want to argue that, but I'm just saying that that's been our tradition, but it doesn't really have to be our future. I mean, we can get more and more explicit, we can get more and more honest, and we can get more and more accountable. So, I guess I could argue that you really can't get away with all those lies anymore. You can't say, I work for the CIA or I do this, because we're sort of, part of our life is on our sleeve. We have a reputation that is findable. You can't just show up in a town with a bunch of stories anymore, kind of thing. Your history is kind of always back there somewhere. It's always findable. So I'm not even using that as an example, but I'm just saying the tendency is to be more honest. The tendency is to appreciate that kind of honesty. The tendency is to associate these with the more educated, more informed, more realistic definitions of what we're doing here. And one of these realistic definitions, one of these new confinements, is the one where you no longer are fulfilling a divine entity's mission statement. So the mission statement's got to be somehow constructed out of this biology, this ooze of want and need. Of replication for the sake of replication. These elements that are not necessarily pretty, and that we have to somehow, if you're going to defend the game, you're going to have to come up with some kind of explanation or some kind of redemption for the overt sloppiness and recklessness and unreasonableness of the intrinsic biological imperative. The intrinsic biological imperative is not doing anything constructive. It doesn't have a purposeful mind, doesn't have a purposeful agenda, and this is just being honest to that truth creates the new dilemma of making up stories is just not good enough. Making up a fable to replace the lie of religion is not a step forward.
It's to dwell in fantasies, but fantasies aren't necessarily, I guess, if they are a sign of mental illness, the entire species is mentally ill. To be human is to fall to that mental illness, which is to entertain fantasies as more real than the direct material substance.
I don't think that's necessarily true, though. I mean, I keep arguing for this distinction between our psychology and our philosophy. So as thinkers, I think we can think about how would I fly to the moon, or we can think about the efficiency of my functionality in the world. And I can think about that from a selfish psychology point of view, but I can also think about that from a philosopher's point of view. and understand the dynamics that I'm one human, and here's the board game, and here's the other humans. And if somebody has to have this happen, well, maybe I'm going to be the right person, or maybe I'm the wrong person, or maybe, I mean, just, we can play it fair. We can build the model, we can construct the understanding. So, again, that's why I'm sort of encouraging these philosophical questions to be made abstractions. So we can say that it's not about being human, it's about, let's say, being Martian, or it's about being Plutonian, or it's about being a Moonican. And if you were going to decide for those beings what their welfare state would be, or what their condition would be, maybe you could do it more realistically as an abstraction, because then your biases and your psychology won't compel you to think about cutenesses and alphaness and all this other ego crap, personal agendas that pervert the ability to have this conversation in a rational manner. But to say that there's nothing fundamentally impossible about making these distinctions between psychology, when we're talking about, imagination we're using to enhance our bedroom behavior, or imagination we're using to understand what it is to be human. These are different applications of imagination, and one of them is for a strict purpose of entertaining, and one is for the strict purpose of gaining insight and understanding. And these are very different things. Entertainment and understanding aren't the same thing.
That's around people. I mean, the demarcation of food and not food, that doesn't necessarily align with edible and nutritious or not, right? I mean, the crap in a fast food bag or in a munchie bag, people may call that food, whereas lots of insects, beetles and slugs, they may not call food.
Well, personally, I would argue that beetles and slugs probably call more things than we call food food. They'll eat your clothes. I mean, they'll eat a lot of things that you won't eat. But, this is where we already start to use the more psychological language, right? Because now we're going to start talking about what's nutritious, or what makes you live longer, not necessarily better. Whether, these are the trade-offs and the value trade-offs. And so you've already injected some value rhetoric, but again, you've done it from a certain psychiatric or psychological perspective of what you claim to be what is valuable. Like somehow nutrition is valuable, when I might argue that no, the only thing that's valuable is that you have the calories to get to the mission statement accomplished, which is get to some point in your life where you resolve your need to need. I mean, isn't that all that you're really trying to do, is get out of here as clean as possible, satisfying as many of your needs as possible? There's not much else to do here, but find some way to satiate your insatiability, and then to extract yourself from the play without having to be forced off the board. But again, that's a value judgment in itself that we could argue about. But I'm just saying it's a truth about the value of this game. If we were talking about the welfare of rats, we wouldn't have much trouble finding probably pretty consistent agreement on the fact that no, it just really doesn't matter whether the rats live 3 years or 4 years. It matters on what they experience in those 3 or 4 years.
When Korzybski did his Science and Sanity, he believed that there was a kind of unsanity, not insanity, but a kind of unsanity that prevailed in the human, and that it would be possible to scientifically bring people into a more sane world, a world.
Yeah, I don't think you can live the two. See, again, I think when you're a philosopher, you're not going to be enjoying yourself. You're not going to be living life. You don't live being a philosopher. You live being a psychology, being living a narrative, a story, a silly adventure game. That's where all the lies are, and the lies really have to be extracted out of the philosopher part. So when you're going to do the thinking better than yourself, all you're saying is, I'm going to be better than the monkey. That is my genetics. That is my motivational mechanisms. I have the same motivational mechanisms as salamanders, as frogs, as really crude animals. I have very crude mechanics that are running inside of me that have nothing to do with intelligence. And I have to, you really have to make a distinction about what you're attempting to do, whether you're trying to make your salamander happy or whether you're trying to use your scheming brain to purify logical process, to take the flaws and the weeds and the bullshit out of your perception of what the world is, and take the errors out of it. Error correction. I mean, that's sort of the philosopher's job, is to take our model of the world, our understanding of the context of our existence, and extract errors from the description.
World with less brutality and senseless violence and all this kind of stuff. The debate that Korzybski got in with Bateson was quite interesting in that regard. For Bateson, there's something about the human which would prevent you from thoroughly getting rid of all of those forms of insanity.
Yeah, well, like I said, again, it really just depends on what you're trying to do. If you really understand your objective is to not be a psychology, not do what I want, but do what the project demands. Like going to the moon. You're not going to the moon is not going to give you an orgasm. Okay, it's not going to fill your belly. It's not going to tell you how great you look in those shoes. It's not going to do this ego thing. It's going to be a mission thing, and you accomplish the mission. You can get some gratification for that, but I'm just saying that the thing is built out of something entirely different. The work of living correctly or living a worthwhile existence requires you to do this work where you're not allowed to be a psychology while you're doing that work. Okay, you're not allowed to allow your psychology to influence the work. You're not allowed to say, to change the numbers in the equation because you like the color yellow, and if you change these numbers, more yellow will be produced when the spaceship launches or something. That would be ridiculous to allow your psychology to pervert the mechanics you're attempting to perfect. And the same is true with philosophy. In the respect, you just can't allow your personal psychology to pollute and pervert what you're attempting to do, which is purify these statements of facts, descriptive statements, and you're trying to purify them, clean them of nonsense and bullshit and erroneous bits and inexplicit bits and inaccurate bits. You're trying to clean it of all these inaccuracies. And that's a worthwhile project.
I think Korzybski believed it would be possible with rigorous training, with his structural differential, right, the anthropometer, which he then developed into the structural differential, this sort of tool for teaching people how to become more conscious of their own abstracting. There were other techniques, that people thought widespread literacy would bring this about. Some people thought that, training in the scientific method would bring this about.
Yeah, well, I think those things would, in the context, like again, where you don't pollute the equation with religious cartoons. So yeah, I just you still got to watch out for the garbage in thing, right? It's this scenario where it doesn't take too many errors in the model to break it. Just as it doesn't take much being wrong with your car to make it not work. I mean, I can just cut a couple of wires, I can disconnect something, I can screw something too tight, screw something too loose, and I can stop your car from working. It doesn't take much to break it. And understanding is just as fragile. It doesn't take too many errors, and you might as well break it all the way. You might as well be catastrophically broken because you're critically broken. Ooh, that's good, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a small error, a small crack is all you need to create enough of a fish. It's like the little hole in the dike. You just need the one little hole, and it'll eventually, through erosion, tear the whole thing down. And that's the danger of error.
I think increasingly, people start to realize that there is an irrationality at the core of the human. And it's not just religious belief. I mean, religious belief has hopped guises from sort of larger contexts of meaning where people have entertained fantasies with their own lives to...
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly argue that nihilism is more retarded than religion. I mean, we can put things on a hierarchy of retardation, okay? I mean, annihilating all meaning to our existence is more fucktarded than creating a God that wound us up and pointed us in a direction. Becoming a Darwinianist, accepting one level of truth and taking it no further than that, understanding that there's nothing but survival. It's the only goal because the DNA says it's the only goal. That kind of illogic of just such an incomplete narrative, an incomplete story, an incomplete description of what we are and what we're capable of and what we're enduring. But we're still stuck with this idea that it's just about making mistakes in description. Really. And again, it's not about what makes you happy, it's about what the truth is. And the truth is out there. The truth is a bird just flew into my damn window. Crazy bastard.
Spending billions of dollars on an entertainment industry that now, they'll spend lots of money to improve the realism of the shadow of a cartoon. I mean, try to think of how many layers of fantasy that is. Right? There's a sense in which the human lives in a world, in modern people here, modern Western folks, right? Not just...
but again, you're going to, pretend that the ancestors, the antiquity, was somehow living some sort of more dignified life because they didn't have that cheat. But they did. They had their witch doctors, and they had their silly rituals that were just as wasteful, just as corrosive, as the $1 Million Shadow. They really were. The voodoo.
Not just tribal peoples who engage in various forms of ritualistic practices, but think of, you can go turn on Antiques Roadshow and watch some person, I think some person just recently, put a bid at I think it was a receipt that James Dean had personally signed, and it was going to go for like $5,000 because James Dean had signed it. Now, if you were an anthropologist, you'd see this as an obvious form of ancestor worship. It's very odd. It's a...
Well, whatever. I don't think it's ancestor worship. It's just celebrity worship. But again, it's the icon worship, and this has always been a problem with us. It's this alpha thing. The juju, all the words you can use for that, mojo, this chasing of some sort of super status, like I said, it's been with us for thousands of years. People have been making 100-foot statues to this crap for thousands of years. I mean, think how many people died, suffered long, hard, hundreds of years to build these monuments.
Kind of religiosity, whether people see it as religiosity or not. When you see the way people venerate dead sports legends, and they know all the statistics about how many home runs some person had, and how many catches, and how many touchdowns, and what...
And again, this is all psychology. It's not philosophy. Religion is a philosophy, so let's understand it, okay? If the religious people want to claim they're just doing something psychological, they're just being addicted to a soap opera, okay? They're just glorifying, they're identifying with underdogs, they're watching a drama, they're vicariously living through the performance, okay, of the play. Now, if they want to say that's all their religion is something that feeds them like a movie feeds them, then fine, but they don't leave it there. They say it's a philosophy. They say it's a description of the truth. And that's the big distinction.
But not of all of these famous but now dead stars, whatever that means. Look at celebrity culture. The way that people traffic in abstract symbols and images of people they've never personally met, and in some way worship them. I mean, it's hard to get at, but there is a secular variety of...
Well, again, it's not so much as secular, it's that it's psychological. It's not a philosophy. It's not a statement about the truth. It's a statement about their psychology, what they love, what they think is beautiful, what they think is aesthetically pleasing. It's okay to have a personal taste, to have an aesthetic taste. But you don't turn it into the truth. You don't say that because I like ballet, ballet is a perfect thing, or some kind of crap like that. You don't take it and make it into a truth about the world. You just make it a truth about your psychology and what pleases you.
Of mental illness, of unsanity, with a perverse interest in what will never be part of a person's life other than the consumed fantasy talk about it, right? The sort of symbol machinery that gets circulated through the media as people chit-chat with their neighbors about, you know, whatever, man, the Kardashians and what they had for breakfast. I mean, some of this stuff is just, it's insane.
And again, but let's recognize that that insanity is overtly psychological, and there isn't somebody saying the Kardashians are God, or the Kardashians are the source of eternal truth, or any of that crap. So there is this really big distinction here. So anyway, got business to do. I'll come back with a part 2 and 3, maybe, who knows. Till next time.